when I chose the topic and the title of my lecture, I was not aware that this would be a summer school. So the idea was to have a discussion about a discussion, or a follow-up of this kind of discussion which I mentioned just a minute ago. Therefore, I have some difficulties to adjust to this type of audience, and the way to do it was to distribute a paper which was not planned for this situation in English, and to have a lecture which uses the same theory, of course, but in different terms, so that you can read something about it and hear a different version, not textually the same version, orally. And the discussion can, of course, use the paper or the oral presentation as a base. The paper is difficult, and there are even unnecessary difficulties in that these are mistakes in spelling. I was not prepared to distribute it before, so the library has exact indications of the mistakes, and there are two bad ones. If you have the paper on page 3, in the first paragraph on the second last line, there should be the system itself or some external unit, not of some external unit. And on page 10, in the second paragraph, the fifth line from below, it should not mean resource to nature, but recourse to nature. So careful readers will have obviously seen already these mistakes, but I mention them, and if you have not the paper, you can go to the library and check the points. Well, the idea of the discussion was to center around a very difficult concept of operational closure, related to the idea of autopoietic systems, self-reproducing systems, closed systems by the operation of producing the system with the means of the system itself. This is a difficult concept, particularly because it goes against very important, deep-rooted, traditional ways to make science or to describe the world. It goes against the subjectivistic tradition, the idealistic, transcendentalistic, or whatever tradition of cognition, in the sense that cognition or observing and describing something is not the affair of a conscious subject alone, whatever the subject then means, the term subject, but it is a real system and object which has the capacity to have cognition, to cognize and to describe and observe the environment, including biological objects like cells or immune systems or nerve systems and so on and so forth. So it is a completely realistic theory, not an idealistic one, but taking into it the whole tradition of idealism by the idea of closure. It is a real system, but a closed system. That's one of the difficulties. And the other is that the empirical sciences normally operate with causal relations, causal laws or attribution of cause and effect. And this concept goes beyond any kind of causal statement. So closure does not mean that there is no influence from the environment to the system or from the system to the environment. There can be any kind of causal relations, interdependencies of all kinds of real possibilities. But the closure, you can nevertheless talk about closure if you focus on the operations of the system as such. So I have the experience that it is completely in vain, has no effect to make these statements in abstract. People immediately, they understand it, but they don't follow. And if I talk about later parts in this lecture, you will forget what I said in the beginning. So I start with the second preliminary remark about the biological roots of the idea. Because autopoiesis was a term invented by Humberto Maturana, a neurophysiologist or biologist. And also the idea of operational closure was very much stimulated by brain research. Because the brain is actually not an open system, but a closed system. The electrical language of a brain can be used only within the brain. The brain has no, or the nervous system, has no access to the environment. It's completely closed, and closure in this sense is the condition of openness. And that's the difficulty. Biologists normally are not aware of the problematic they go into when they combine brain research or nervous system or describing the animal from a biological, biochemical point of view or genetic point of view on the one side and the behavior on the other side. Because they, as biologists, would have to face the question, how comes that an animal sees space, can observe other animals, can react on distance, although it has only a nervous system which is limited to observe the own organism. The nervous system is a self-observing part of the organism. And how is it possible to see space and time and movement, to see an other animal moving and seeing the identity of the animal in different parts of a space, of the outer world? So this is a general problem. How is it possible to have a closed system which nevertheless transcends its own boundaries, but not in operating on an operational level, not in using its own operations to contact the environment, but somehow differently. I use this paradigm of biological facts and knowledge not to make an analogy. My argument is not that because the organisms have a certain structure, a certain way of reproducing themselves, therefore social systems have to do the same thing. It is not an argument, it is not a metaphorical use of biological terms, and it is not an argument by analogy. It is simply the idea that there is a very general problem which is important for biologists and for sociologists as well. And the general problem is the problem of operational closure. I can formulate this in a rather trivial way in saying that no system is able to operate outside of its own boundaries. It is, of course, a system can extend its boundaries, but it cannot operate in the environment. It can shrink or expand. Like a communicative system, you can choose new topics or new persons to talk with. But it cannot operate outside of its own boundaries. And this is quite evident, but the effects on traditional thinking are formidable. The effects on traditional thinking are revolutionary in a certain sense. And this is, well, the best way, I think, to introduce the topic of this lecture. How is it possible to transcend the boundaries without transcending them, to make it a paradoxical statement, to stay in the system and nevertheless have an access to the environment, to produce openness by closure. My attempt to answer this is, and I can have to make it very short, is the idea that a system, at least these type of systems, are able to internalize the difference of internal and external, to use the distinction of system and environment within the system. They cannot operate in the environment, but they can use the distinction of system and environment to guide internal operations. There is in the logic, which is not very known, or it's kind of algebra, arithmetic algebra, reconstruction of Boole's algebra by somebody called Spencer Brown, George Spencer Brown. The references are in the text here. And he constructs the logic of transforming distinctions, building up complexity by transforming distinctions, beginning with the kind of injunction, make a distinction, otherwise you see nothing. If you don't distinguish what you want to see, make a distinction. And the theory ends with the concept of re-entry. The distinction re-enters the distinguished. This is a mystical thing. I mean, he used the term, the idea of an imaginary space from mathematics to make this point, but as soon as you introduce this into the social system field, you see immediately that you can use the idea of re-entry, because the distinction of system and environment can re-enter the system. Whatever the logical base of this thing, that's quite unclear, and we do a lot of work on this now in Bielefeld. But it is clear that systems are able to transform the original distinction, the discrimination, the drawing of a boundary into a distinction which they can use within the system. So re-entry of a form into the form of a distinction into the distinction is the methodological base idea of what I wanted to say now. I have to skip the epistemological side. I'm just going to publish a book on the science of the society, the science as a subsystem of society, where there are 700 pages on this kind of thing. The essential point is that philosophers of the recent decades had, and also linguists and all kinds of semiotic writers, had the problem of reference. How talking goes out of the words and into the reality, how there is a reference within the discourse, within the word of Saussure, the language and whatever, to outside, how to come from the inside to the outside. And I replace this question completely, the question of roots of reference in the terms of Quine, by the idea that the essential point is how a system handles the distinction between self-reference and external reference. How a system operatively handles the distinction between self-reference and external reference within a closed system. And you see, this is another version of the basic problem, how a closed system can construct openness. Now, the next step is to apply this to social systems in general and to society, the encompassing social system in particular. The main point is that we have to be very precise in defining what kind of operation constructs a system. What kind of operation fulfills the requirements of autopoiesis? What kind of operation makes the difference, produces the difference between system and environment? Produces the difference between system and environment, and secondly, constructs this distinction as a guideline or a code for internal operations. And then is able to simultaneously have two faces, one to the outside, one to the inside, self-reference, external reference. And my answer is communication. Communication would be the operation which produces the system out of its own means. That means produces communication by communication. And there's no other factor except communication producing and reproducing the system. Closure on the base of communication. And then to see how we have to understand communication if we want to use the term for this theoretical purpose, within this theoretical design. This again I have to skip more or less. The essential point is just to see communication not as an action of an individual, because then you have body and mind of an individual within your scheme, and you come not to say that communication is only a product of communication. So we have to avoid the idea of communicative action, and we have to avoid the idea of transmission by communication. So it goes against everything you read normally if you look under the word communication. And it replaces this type of theory with the idea that communication is a certain type of distinction. Certain type of distinction. If you perceive the behavior of other persons, you perceive the behavior, you see an object. But if you see communication, you see a difference. And this is the difference between utterance, expressive behavior on the one side, and information. So as soon as you observe somebody else, not how, if he is beauty or ugly, young or old, and how he behaves and what kind of impression he conveys, but if you look with the help of the distinction, what does he mean in saying this? What is the information? and why, what kind of intention he has to say this now. As soon as you observe in this way, you observe communication. And only if you observe in this way, you can contribute to communication. And so there is a takeoff of a new level of reality, communication as a continual movement to make a distinction and transform a distinction of utterance and information. So this is probably not understandable in this short version, but my intention is to write a theory of society on the basis of this kind of communicative closure. The society is a system which closes on the basis of communication and reconstructs the world because it includes the moment of information into its own operation. So it has an outside contact via information, which is constructed within the system, and it has self-reference in terms of utterance, of the operative part of the communicative process. So the distinction of utterance and information is at the same time a reconstruction of the idea of self-reference and external reference. Now time is running, and I have to come to the next step. Even if you follow to this point, and if you accept the theory to this point, the most difficult things is to come. Because if we construct a society as a system closed on the operation of communication and open only within this context, how could we conceive of systems within the society also as closed systems? Can there be closed systems within closed systems? Can there be operational closure within a society? Could we have an operational closure on the level of the legal system, or on the level of science, or on the level of the economic system, even if already the society is a closed system? Or in other words, how are we to define the operation which closes a system within another system? There is similar discussion in biology concerning, for example, brain research, because the neurons, the cells, are closed systems, and the brain is also a closed system, which works on the basis of cells, but has an own type of closure. And so there again are similarities, but not analogical reasoning, comparing living organisms and social systems on the other side. Then, of course, the question comes, what is the type of operation which closes a legal system and which makes it possible to go from one legal operation to a next legal operation, or to distinguish in choosing to communicate within the legal system what is legally relevant and what is not legally relevant. And we have the prime impression is, of course, the first impression is that legal systems should be able to distinguish legal questions and other questions. Somehow it is not going against common sense to say that a judge must be able to say, well, this is not legally relevant and this is legally relevant. It is only unusual to see this process of this distinction of legally relevant, legally irrelevant, as a productive process reproducing the system. But then how could we describe this way of recognizing operations which belong to the system and distinguish them or discriminate them against other operations which do not belong to the system. Originally, I thought, coming from a functionalist background, that function is the answer. We should define the function of the legal system and then see which kind of operations serve the function of the legal system. Then I did proceed to try to define the function of a system as, in this case, stabilizing normative expectations in spite of possible disappointment. So the legal system produces counterfactual expectations. They hold true, they are stable even if people act against them. And they are created precisely for this purpose. If nobody can act otherwise, there's no point to make a norm. Norms are stabilizing improbable expectations, improbable structures against which you can go, but are not supposed to do it. And it builds the system on the level of these type of norms. This is the point I made in this book, Rechtssoziologie. But then is this sufficient to recognize or to make the distinction between the legal system on the one side and the environment on the other side? And I found finally, no, it's not sufficient. Because it would not be suitable for the legal system always to control the function. Because if you have a function, you have functional equivalence. You can ask for other types of performances which have the same function. So function is a much too open concept to define the specific legal operations. So I was forced to look for other, in addition, not excluding the functional point of view, but in addition to look for other ways to define how a system, or to determine how a system recognizes its own closure and makes the distinction between internal and external. And the main idea is to use the concept of binary code, meaning that always if an operation, a communication, orients itself to the difference legally right, legally wrong, or legal illegal, then the operation goes into is part of the legal system. If not, then not. If you think in terms of morally good or morally bad, this is not a legal distinction. If you think in terms of profitable, non-profitable, it is not a legal distinction. If you think in terms of, well, this is good for the opposition, this is good for the government, it is a political distinction, but not a legal distinction. So with the idea that there are many different function systems and many different binary codes in modern society, I think I'm able to define relatively clearly what kind of operations are assumed to be legal one and how normal people, without turning to the difficult question of function, are able to make the distinction. For example, in marriage relations, family relations, as soon as you say, well, if you act in this way, this gives a reason for divorce, then you are operating within the legal system, because you use a legal term and the distinction right, wrong, legal, illegal. But if you simply complain about the behavior of your husband or your wife, then you are in the family system. And normally, there's a very important empirical point in this, to see at what point operations tend to shift from everyday life or family life or commercial relations to legal problems. When people dare to ask the quaestio juris, the legal question. And one of the experience I had with Roman law is that the fantastic capacity of Roman lawyers to have the quaestio juris within a political system, within a political system of political relevance. And the quaestio juris, the question of law, was a way to get out of politics and to go into a kind of structured, more structured situation. So I think this idea of which code you choose is a very powerful discriminator in everyday life, not only in a scientific reconstruction of everyday life. And of course, it is possible to do empirical research on different countries, different times, different situations. Big business, for example, is very reluctant to pose the legal question in one sense, and to avoid, and they have other ways to cope with difficult problems. Then I need a third idea besides function and code, that is the actual state of the system. Because if you have the distinction right and wrong, this is too abstract. You have a concept like divorce, or contract, or corporate law, or some tax, or something which makes it possible to attribute the value, the positive value and the negative value, to the communicative, to the outcome of the communication. To say this is right, this is wrong, you have to have more than simply the distinction. The distinction is logically a symmetric situation. You can exchange the values. The negative value is not the positive value, and the negation of the positive value is the negative value, and that's completely open. So you need programs. And programs are always historically fixed things. So there is a continual reference to the actual state of the system with the help of the code and with the idea of functional differentiation. But the practical thing is to know what the law is and to know in which situation you can successfully argue legally or not successfully. So there are actually three factors which separate the legal communication from political ones, economic ones. The function, the coding, and the reference to the recursivity, the reference to the system which has produced itself and will reproduce itself further on. Well, I have two more points. One is how does the system handle, the legal system now, handle the difference between internal and external states? The system itself, self-reference and external reference. And in principle, I have two different answers, one on the operative level. Then the system is, I use the formula normatively closed and cognitively open. Normatively closed in the sense that on the level of norms, counterfactual expectations in face of possible disappointments, on this level the system is closed. Only legal norms count. No moral norms, no technical criteria, not problems of accounting and business, except if a legal norm refers to them. So it is normatively closed, and the only system which achieves closure on the basis of norms is the legal system, not the moral system. We have no morally closed system. Moral is a too weak and too fluid way to make points, to have positive and negative values. As soon as you achieve closure, the system becomes a legal system, independent of what kind of norms it is. Independence, it's not a definition by content, by meaning. It is simply a definition by form, by autopoietic closed forms. And then you can say a system is normatively closed, but cognitively open. Because there are always facts are relevant for the system. Did somebody kill somebody else? You will remark in the text that I use the phrase, if somebody kills another woman, to make a reflection about sexist terminology. You are aware that somebody is another woman, but you are aware only a little bit too late to understand the phrase. So this is an example, and of course, whether this is a fact or not is not normatively prescribed. So the system has a large part of the daily operations are cognitive. And in fact, most of the legal problems or the legal procedures are decided on facts and not on norms. The interpretative part of a legal system is 10%, 20% perhaps, but most of the legal issues are issues about facts, not about norms. This is one thing. You can say that the distinction between normative and cognitive expectations are at the same time a distinction between self-reference and external reference. Then, on a second level, a system observing or constructing its own way of operation, we have a different type of distinction within the legal dogmatics now between concepts and interests. Probably the controversial issue, Begriffsjurisprudence, conceptual jurisprudence, or analytic jurisprudence on the one side, and interest jurisprudence on the other side. It is very unhappy, suitable to scientific tastes, to have controversies on this issue. My point is that it is always simultaneously, you have two references on concepts and on interests, not the one excluding the other, but continually transforming the distinction of concepts and interest. So it is not a question of schools and of ways to construct legal dogmatics, but on the operative level, on the self-observation of a system, conceptual issues and interest issues are always implied, with, of course, different weight for the decision. Sometimes the interest is more important, sometimes the concept is more decisive. So I have two ways to reconstruct the difference of internal self-observation, self-reference, and external reference within the legal system. And you see that I use a very general conceptual idea to construct specialties of the legal system, and I do the same thing for the economic system, for example, with the concept of transaction. I cannot go into this here now. And then the perhaps a kind of relief comes from the last part of the lecture, focusing on structural coupling. Structural coupling as a term which is compatible with closure, compatible with autopoietic autonomy, with autopoietic reproduction. But these systems operate as real systems in a real world under real constraining conditions. And Maturana, it's the concept of Maturana, did use the idea of structural coupling to describe the relation of autopoietic, closed, autonomous living system to the environment. If we use the same idea in social science, we have, of course, we need a type of clarification on the concept of structural coupling. Structural coupling means channeling influences. On the one side, excluding a lot of influences of the environment on the system, and within a small range of allowed, permitted influences, to increase possibilities. Again, a difficult two-phase concept of exclusion and inclusion, and increasing power and increasing potential for building up complexity by excluding many other things. So, for example, if you have the society as a communicative system, the structural coupling is consciousness, goes to consciousness. Because only conscious individuals can participate in communication. If there were no if consciousness would be destroyed by some kind of catastrophe, communication would stop immediately. But the important thing is that nothing else can irritate, provoke, perturb communication except consciousness. So the world has no direct access to communication except by consciousness. And consciousness, the individual consciousness, is not able to determine communication, but simply to irritate the communicative system. This is an idea which is close to the concept of assimilation et accommodation of Piaget. It's a closed system, but the system can take up irritations from the environment. It is not determined. No communication is determined